An innocent black woman gets framed by corrupt cops, but what they don't know is she's Big Shaq's daughter. They tried to bury her with lies, not knowing her legacy was built to rise. This isn't just about justice, it's about blood, truth, and the storm coming for them all. When power forgets its roots, legacy reminds them. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun in Savannah slid through the live oak trees, like gold dust caught in a southern breeze. The sidewalks were just waking up, coffee steam drifting from corner cafes, bicycle wheels squeaking down cobblestone paths, and street vendors setting up their humble stalls. Amid the quiet thrum of the city's breath, Leona Brooks walked with a rhythm all her own. She always did. Her heels tapped lightly as she crossed Jefferson Street, her canvas tote swinging at her side. Worn from years of carrying more than just papers, files, forgotten stories, bruised hopes. She worked at the Riverlight Center for Justice, a modest two-story building tucked between a shuttered barbershop and a church that only opened its doors on Sundays and funerals. Leona wasn't just a caseworker, she was a listener, a memory keeper, the one who remembered birthdays when no one else did, the kind of soul who stayed late to write letters for inmates who hadn't heard from their families in years. She moved with grace, her posture straight, her expression calm, but beneath the skin there was a storm held by discipline. That's how you survive the system. Graceful stillness. Even when the walls whispered, she didn't notice the patrol car creeping behind her until she reached her sedan. The door was halfway open when the voice echoed. "Ma'am, can we speak with you for a moment?" Leona turned slowly, instinctively clutching her keys. Two officers stood there, one middle-aged, thick-jawed with graying temples, and an overconfident gait, the other younger, thin-eyed, with a clipboard tucked under his arm, like a prop he didn't know how to use. They wore those artificial smiles officers put on when they've already decided the outcome. Her voice came out even. "Is there a problem?" The older one, Detective Riggs, stepped forward too close, smelling faintly of last night's cheap coffee. "License and registration, please." Infused, Leona obliged. She handed them over, waiting as the two officers whispered just out of earshot. They didn't run her license. They didn't even pretend to. Instead, Riggs looked back at her like he was trying to decide if she fit the shape of a lie he was already crafting. "We've had reports of your vehicle being involved in suspicious activity around Dockside Avenue," he said. Her brows tightened. "I've never even driven." "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle, please." The command came so quickly, it sliced the sentence she was forming. Her heartbeat sped, but her face held still, always still. She took one small step back, not out of guilt, but because some part of her had been raised to know that a wrong movement could mean more than a wrong word. They searched the car, rapidly, too rapidly. Within minutes, a small black pouch was pulled from beneath her passenger seat. She didn't recognize it, had never seen it. The zipper opened and tiny packets of white powder spilled into Riggs's gloved hands, like a magician's trick. But no one clapped. The younger cop's jaw tensed. "Cocaine packaged for distribution," Riggs said like he was reading off a bad script. Leona blinked, her mind moving at 1,000 miles an hour, but her body paralyzed by the moment's absurdity. "That's not mine," she said quietly. Riggs didn't even glance at her. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute. You have the right to remain silent." She heard the rest, but the words floated above her like fog. Cold steel kissed her wrists. A passing car slowed. Some bystanders raised their phones, and Savannah, sweet, sleepy Savannah, watched one of its own disappear behind police glass. At the station, they kept her in a holding room that smelled of bleach and forgotten stories. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering every few seconds like they couldn't make up their minds. She sat alone, palms sweating, staring at her own reflection in the glass wall that separated her from a world she no longer recognized. Her phone had been taken, her belongings catalogued, her voice for now muted. Hours passed before anyone returned. Then came the questions, not from curiosity, but from routine. Not to find truth, but to check boxes. "Do you know a Luther Quinn?" "No." "Have you ever been to the warehouse district?" "No." "Have you accessed private employee files at your center recently?" "I work with records." "Of course I have." They noted that, as if working with documents made her dangerous. As the interrogation ended, she was told her bail hearing would be in the morning. But something about the way Riggs looked at her, calm, satisfied, told her this wasn't meant to be temporary. They weren't just trying to scare her. They wanted her buried. Back in her cell, she stared up at the ceiling. The dream she'd had the night before returned. A faceless man standing at the edge of a gym court, holding a basketball out toward her with arms longer than shadows. She hadn't understood it then. She didn't now. But it lingered. She thought about the files she had flagged the week prior. A string of internal police memos, misfiled under city sanitation. They looked like mislabeling at first. But she had traced some of them to community arrests, where footage mysteriously disappeared. She had raised a quiet concern, nothing formal, just a question to her supervisor.
Was that it?
Was that the trigger? The thought made her stomach turn. She hadn't done anything wrong. But here she was, stripped of her dignity, reduced to a mugshot and an accusation. And the worst part was the silence. The absolute stillness of being accused without being heard. Across town, the sun had begun to fall. Orange and amber washed across the streets where she once walked freely. Her name was now tied to a case number, her face to a file, her voice to nothing. In another part of the city, televisions flickered with the evening news, and on one of them, behind a cracked mirror in a modest gym, Shaquille O'Neal stared at the screen, frozen. The segment was short. A young woman arrested on drug charges, accused of gang affiliations. Her photo flashed on screen. Her name was spoken. Leona Brooks. Shaq didn't blink. There was something about her. The slope of her cheek, the quiet fire in her eyes, something unshakable. He walked over to the remote and rewound it. There it was again. Her posture, the way she held herself. He had seen that before. Once. In a woman with a velvet voice and storm-battered soul. A woman named Janelle Carter. He whispered under his breath. No way. In Savannah's golden dusk, two stories were beginning to converge. One behind bars, the other behind memories. Neither of them knew how deeply they were connected, or how far the silence would echo once it was finally broken. In the quiet stretch between dusk and dawn, Shaquille O'Neal lived in the kind of stillness few men ever earned. His home was modest for someone who'd made millions. A wide ranch-style house just outside Orlando, with earth-toned walls, no velvet ropes, no shrines to trophies or framed jerseys crowding the halls. To the world he was still Big Shaq, the giant with the laugh that could shake a building and the hands that held more rings than most could dream of. But in this house, he was just Shaquille, a man who had built empires, then quietly walked away from them to chase something deeper, or maybe to escape something that had long haunted him. He spent his mornings delivering meals to veterans, without cameras trailing him. Afternoons he'd appear at local schools, talking not about basketball but about discipline, direction, and finding your voice. Evenings, he disappeared into silence. There were no parties, no press, only a weight he rarely spoke of, and a memory he refused to bury. The television was on that night, humming in the background like white noise as he made a cup of peppermint tea. He rarely paid attention to the news anymore. Too many faces, too many headlines that all sounded the same. But something made him look up. Her picture was only on screen for a few seconds. Young black woman. Arrested. Alleged involvement in a drug trafficking operation near Savannah. Her name, Leona Brooks. The image cut to a grainy security camera still. Her hands behind her back. Her expression unreadable, but strong. A flicker of something in her eyes. Pride, fear, resilience, pain. Something he recognized. Something he had seen once before, long ago. He walked closer to the screen. It wasn't just that she looked familiar. It was the way she carried herself, even while being arrested. Head high, chin still. Like someone who'd learned young that silence could be armor. That the world wouldn't offer kindness easily. He muted the television and stared. Janelle. The name crashed into him like an aftershock from years ago. He hadn't said her name aloud in over a decade. Janelle Carter, the jazz singer with a voice that could pull glass into tears. A laugh that stayed in a man's ribs long after she'd left the room. She had performed at a charity gala in Miami when Shaq was still at the height of his fame. He remembered the evening like a photo sealed in time. They had met, shared drinks, drifted into long talks that became nights, and then weeks. It hadn't lasted long. Their lives moved on opposite rails. But something had been left behind. Something she tried to tell him once. She'd called 3 times. He missed all 3. And then the fire. The news said she died in an apartment blaze. Electrical failure. No foul play. But no follow-up either. He remembered reading it and feeling hollow. He never knew about a child. He turned off the television and walked into his office, flipping open an old photo album. Tucked near the back was a folded program from Janelle's last live performance. There was her face, smiling beside a saxophone player, and handwritten inside the program cover, "To S. Always the calm in my storm. Be well." Shaq sat down heavily. He opened his laptop, Googled Leona Brooks. A few articles surfaced. Local advocacy worker, case manager, clean record, top of her class at Southern University. No priors, no known associates in any gang. So why her? He clicked through more pages, reading details that didn't add up. No motive, no evidence aside from a single planted item in her car. No history of behavior even close to criminal. But what chilled him most were the small hints of administrative errors. Her intake forms missing timestamps, a misfiled warrant, arresting officers with internal affairs complaints conveniently sealed.
It didn't look like justice. It looked like sabotage.
He leaned back, closing his eyes. In his chest, a quiet drumbeat started. One he hadn't felt since walking onto the court before a championship. The kind of pressure that builds not from fame or expectation, but from knowing something sacred is on the line. He didn't know for certain who Leona Brooks was, but something told him she was more than just a stranger with a familiar face. She was a reflection, a mirror held up to a moment he had missed and never forgiven himself for. Shaq opened a secure folder on his computer, one reserved for his private contacts, names he rarely called, people he trusted beyond contracts and business. At the top of the list was one, Ruth Delacroix, retired judge, civil rights legend, and someone who had once told him, "The law bends, Shaq, but only if you push hard enough." He didn't call her, not yet. Instead, he pulled up a donation record to the Riverlight Center, where Leona had worked. His name wasn't listed. He'd made the contribution anonymously 6 months prior. Now, it felt like more than coincidence. It felt like the universe had been drawing circles, waiting for him to see the center. There was no plan yet. No proof. But there was a pull, a gravity in his gut that told him the next steps weren't about legacy or image. They were about redemption, about listening to the voice he had ignored long ago. He sat quietly in the dark for a long time, and when he finally rose, he wasn't just Shaquille O'Neal, the retired giant, who entertained the world. He was a man chasing the ghost of a name, and maybe, just maybe, finding the beginning of something worth fighting for. The precinct looked like every other government building in America. Too beige, too quiet, and too sterile to suspect the rot inside. Fluorescent lights hummed above faded carpet. A soda machine in the break room had been out of order for months. Hallway bulletin boards bore laminated posters about equity and community trust. But beneath that thin layer of idealism sat drawers full of manipulated reports, doctored arrest logs, and a code of silence spoken louder than any badge oath. Detective Henry Riggs knew the game better than most. 30 years on the force, eyes that had seen too much, and processed even less. He walked with the weary entitlement of a man who believed the world owed him comfort for doing the bare minimum of good. His tie was always a little loose, shirt collar rumpled, coffee breath persistent. But Riggs didn't care about presentation. He cared about control, and he kept his control not through power, but by managing perception, making it look like the dirt always came from someone else's shoes. Officer Drew Bellamy was younger, hungry, still shiny in the way new corruption is. He looked like the face they'd use for diversity posters. Neat buzz cut, clean jawline, practiced warmth in his voice. But Bellamy had a talent for reclassification. Misdemeanors turned felonies under his pen. Inconvenient arrests vanished with administrative shorthand, and the right keywords found their way into databases, like whispers sewn into the system. The department had been quiet for months. No whistleblowers, no protests, just a slow churn of minor cases swept under a rising tide of order. Until a name came across Bellamy's desk in a weekly update from community outreach liaisons, Leona Brooks. She had flagged files. Files she shouldn't have had access to. The phrase was vague, hidden under an internal alert, generated by an AI tool meant to protect privileged law enforcement documents. No bells rang publicly, no red stamps. But inside the precinct's digital vault, her name tripped a buried protocol from 6 years ago, one created by Riggs himself after another near miss with exposure. It was a safeguard against people like her, people who paid attention. Leona's casework activity showed she had downloaded 3 PDFs that included composite reports tied to Operation Fenlight, an old drug task force initiative shut down after rumors of excessive force and improper procedure. The files she accessed contained redacted arrest logs from a housing project cleanup. A pattern lived there: too many black and brown names, too few convictions, and one line item nobody was supposed to see. Confiscated property logged at warehouse on 17. Missing chain of custody signatures. Riggs read it twice, then called Bellamy into his office. They didn't need to speak much. The look was enough. Bellamy had already run a soft inquiry on Leona. No priors, no affiliations, good reputation in the community. Top of her class. That made her dangerous. Clean people made better symbols when they fell. "What's her angle?" Bellamy asked, arms crossed, standing under the slow-turning ceiling fan. Riggs rubbed his temples. Gang tie-in, dockside stash. She accessed drug seizure logs. Let's make it look like she flagged them for someone. Paid to delete evidence. Bellamy raised an eyebrow. Bit of a stretch. Riggs leaned back, smiled like a man who'd done this before. Doesn't need to hold forever. Just needs to stick long enough for discredit. Once her name's in the mud, she's not a threat. Besides, she's got the look. Bellamy knew what that meant. Young, black, strong eyes. The kind of face that couldn't be ignored if left to rise. So it had to be broken early, framed as the exception to her community instead of the hope of it.
They went to work.
An anonymous tip was logged into the tipline system, citing Leona's car, frequenting the dockside district. A routine patrol was staged. The pouch of white powder wasn't even real cocaine. It was processed flour, packed and labeled with expired narcotics unit tags. Riggs preferred not to use real product, unless necessary. The visual was more important than the substance. The traffic stop was quick, clean, scripted. Leona's arrest was handled on a day when the media team had a scheduled rotation. A young, new intern eager to catch a headline. Within hours, her mugshot was shared with selected outlets. Local papers ran it under the banner of community worker tied to drug activity. No official charges yet, just accusations. But accusations could do the work. Truth could. What Riggs hadn't anticipated, however, was the old system pinging again. A second alert had gone off, this time not within the precinct, but buried deep inside the county child services database, tied to a forgotten case file from 2 decades earlier. The connection was subtle, a back-end sync between Leona's social security number and a sealed birth record. It had nothing to do with the drug file. It was just a glitch, but the moment Riggs opened it, the breath in his chest slowed.
Mother, Janelle Carter. Deceased.
Father, unlisted. Attached note: paternity claim unresolved. Known alias. Riggs stared at the screen. He remembered Janelle. Everyone in the precinct did. She had been a thorn years back, poking into misconduct around her building's safety violations. When the fire happened, Riggs was on the scene. Electrical accident, they said. But he remembered the residue, the misplaced insulation, the report he doctored. He hadn't known she had a daughter, and certainly not by him. There was only one person Janelle ever referred to as SO in conversations. It had become a precinct rumor, a giant of a man she once dated, quietly, briefly, who had visited her shows in Miami, left generous tips under napkins, and then disappeared. Riggs always assumed it was myth, but now, he clicked deeper. Leona's donation records showed a pattern, not in her name, but in the funds allocated to her justice center. A 6-figure anonymous donor, once every 6 months, same routing signature, private trust fund. He traced it back through public records, looking for the shell company. It was buried well, but Riggs had been in the game too long not to see the code beneath the names. O'Neill Legacy Foundation. His mouth dried. She wasn't just a caseworker who got curious. She wasn't just some girl with sharp eyes. She was connected. Riggs stood slowly, walked to his office window, and looked out over the empty precinct lot. A single street lamp flickered in the distance. The silence around him felt different, now, not calm, but heavy, like something had shifted in the air. Bellamy knocked once, and entered. "You good?" Riggs nodded slowly. "Yeah, just tired." Bellamy shrugged. "She won't be a problem. The system will hold. It always does." Riggs didn't answer. He wasn't so sure anymore. Because systems only held when no one with real power was watching. And if this girl was who he now suspected she was, then someone with power might already be looking. In the corner of a dimly lit storage facility on the outskirts of Chatham County, dust lay like a skin on everything. The place hadn't been opened in years. Rows of metal shelves stretched long and rusted, sagging beneath the weight of forgotten histories. It was the kind of space used to bury what didn't fit in official records. Misfiled adoption papers, incomplete juvenile profiles, and case files nobody wanted to explain. The key to Unit 3118 had been sent anonymously, tucked inside a yellowed envelope with no return address. The lock clicked open with resistance, as if the past itself hesitated to be disturbed. Inside, cardboard boxes were stacked in leaning towers. A faint smell of mildew and paper rot clung to the air. One of the boxes near the center bore a faded label. Brooks, Leona M. Foster transfer. The file inside was brittle. The cover peeled like old paint, but the contents were intact. Hand-typed reports, evaluation notes, and copies of documents, stamped confidential. Tucked in the back was an original intake form from a now-defunct home placement agency. Scrawled in blue ink were the names: child, Leona Marin Brooks; mother, Janelle Carter; father, claimed but unverified; subject referred as Shaquille O'Neal. Note: paternity not pursued; mother deceased; father unresponsive to outreach. File sealed upon mother's death. For a moment the words sat quietly on the page. No fanfare, no bright highlights. Just a fact sealed in the shadows. A truth that never made it to light. The accompanying social worker report gave more context. Leona had been placed into temporary care after her mother perished in an apartment fire in Jacksonville. And Janelle Carter, profession: musician, had been vocal in the months prior about unsafe wiring, ignored city inspections, and rising harassment from her building's landlord. Complaints had been logged, then erased. 2 formal requests for building inspections were delayed. The third was closed without follow-up. 3 weeks later, the fire started. It began in the kitchen, quickly consumed the apartment. The report stated Janelle died of smoke inhalation. There was no mention of foul play. No autopsy followed. The case was closed by the lead officer on duty, Detective Henry Riggs, Chatham County Task Force, assigned to out-of-county cooperation at the time. There was no mention of a child found in the home, no acknowledgement of Leona's presence. She had been away, staying overnight with a neighbor while her mother traveled to a gig. It was the neighbor who notified authorities that a child would now be without a guardian. That moment, a single night of separation, had severed Leona from everything she'd ever known. And now, years later, the man who signed off on her mother's death, the one who framed her for a crime she didn't commit, was the same man who buried her truth. Back in the city, Riggs sat at his desk staring at an open folder on his screen. The file from his own past had found its way to the surface. He wasn't sure how. Maybe someone had reopened the database he thought long deleted. Maybe some clerk cleaning up backlogs had clicked one wrong document. Or maybe the system was finally turning against him. He remembered the fire. Not just the flames, but the woman. Janelle. Her voice still lived somewhere in his mind. Soft but direct. She had come to the precinct multiple times to report harassment, unsafe conditions. She had accused the landlord of cutting corners on wiring. Said she was being intimidated to move out so they could sell the property. She brought photos, handwritten logs, copies of late-night notes left on her door. But Riggs had orders. The landlord was connected. A donor to the mayor's re-election campaign. A friend of a friend in real estate development circles. Nothing overt. Just pressure. A word here, a suggestion there. He remembered how it was handled. Her file was flagged in progress, then quietly closed. And when the fire happened, it was packaged fast. No need for noise. The coroner was told not to press. The mother was gone. The child placed, case closed. What Riggs hadn't known then, and hadn't cared to find out, was that the child, Leona, carried more than a tragic origin. She carried a name. The police never looked into the father. The form listed him loosely. Shaquille O'Neal was written more as rumor than reality. Janelle had never pushed for formal acknowledgement. Riggs remembered seeing the name, and scoffing. Must be some delusion, he'd muttered at the dime, tossing the idea aside. There were always women claiming to have ties to famous men. He didn't take it seriously. He didn't want to. But what if it had been real? Riggs leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Sweat began to gather at his temple. He had built his legacy on erasure. Deleting inconvenient facts, bending stories before they could breathe. But this one was unraveling. Not just because of who Leona was, but because of what she might become. Across town, in a quiet law office, Judge Ruth Delacroix sat at a wide wooden desk, surrounded by boxes of files, most forgotten cases, all worth more than their weight in paper. She had just opened a packet delivered earlier that day, unsigned, sent from an untraceable courier. Inside was the copy of Leona's sealed birth record and the original case number from the fire. As she read it, something stirred in her. She remembered Janelle, a voice that filled the old clubs with velvet and thunder, a woman who had come to her once, quietly, to ask about tenant rights. Ruth had pointed her toward advocacy channels, unaware at the time that it might be the last time anyone would hear Janelle ask for help. She stared now at the file. A daughter left in silence, a legacy erased, and a father, one whose shadow stretched across the nation, completely unaware of the bloodline written in ashes. Ruth folded the papers carefully, slid them into her case folder, and locked the drawer. The past was waking up, and it was whispering to everyone who tried to bury it. The morning came slow, thick with humidity, as if the Florida sky itself was bracing for something it couldn't name. Shaquille O'Neal stood in the middle of his home office, surrounded by the quiet hum of computers and the static weight of the truth he could no longer ignore. Sunlight bled through the blinds, slicing across framed photos and sports memorabilia, but the glow didn't reach his eyes. He hadn't slept. The folder on his desk remained open, its contents laid bare. Copies of foster records, a sealed birth certificate, 2 yellowing case reports, and 1 black and white photo of a younger Janelle Carter, holding a baby, her expression distant yet determined. He had stared at that image for over an hour, like it might suddenly move and explain everything. His name had been on the file. Not assumed, not speculated, written plainly, scrawled in ink on a line meant for acknowledgement, and he hadn't been there. Shaq had spent his life showing up on courts, in studios, in boardrooms, behind microphones. But this was the place he should have been decades ago. And now the echo of that absence was sitting in front of him in a brown manila folder. He traced a finger across the photo slowly. Leona, he whispered, tasting the name, letting it settle on his tongue like prayer and punishment at once. He'd spent the last 2 days in digital silence. No interviews, no appearances, just research. He'd built a quiet network over the years, a web of trusted friends, lawyers, and old-school data miners who owed him favors. And what they'd found painted a story darker than he could have imagined. Leona had flagged internal city records linked to past precinct corruption. Her casework had crossed into restricted digital territory, likely without her knowing. Shortly after, her arrest was engineered by officers with sealed misconduct files and unexplained financial movements in their accounts. Her vehicle was clean until the day it was searched. Surveillance footage of the traffic stop never made it to evidence. And it wasn't just a setup, it was a containment. Someone wanted her credibility dead before she ever had the chance to become more than a clerk with too much curiosity. They wanted her silenced or erased, but none of them knew who she was. Shaq stood up and walked across the room, his bare feet heavy against the hardwood. He stopped by a low cabinet and unlocked it. Inside were names, people he trusted when the spotlight burned too bright. At the top of that list, Judge Ruth Delacroix. He dialed the number. She answered after the first ring. "Shaquille," she said, her voice clipped but knowing. "I need you." I figured. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Ruth had been through too much in her lifetime to need context when she heard the weight in someone's voice. She had served on the bench for 30 years, and retired not because she was tired, but because the machine had made it impossible to move without breaking her own bones in the process. "I have a file I need you to see. It's about a girl. Her name is Leona Brooks. She was arrested in Savannah last week." A pause. "I've already seen it," Ruth said. Shaq froze. "It landed on my desk 2 nights ago. Anonymous drop. Foster records. Old fire case. Her mother, Janelle." Shaq's throat clenched. "She's mine," he said quietly. Ruth didn't speak for a while. She let the silence sit between them like a mirror. "She doesn't know?" she finally asked. "No." "You plan to tell her?" "Not yet. I don't want her to see me before she sees justice." Ruth exhaled into the phone. "Then we start carefully. Quietly. You don't go public. Not yet. We need leverage. Something that makes noise in the right rooms without drawing attention to you. I've got resources. I've got reach. What you don't have is the freedom to move like you used to." Eyes follow you, Shaq. We can't afford a leak. Shaq nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Then we move underground, he said. Over the next 48 hours, a plan formed like slow-moving thunderclouds. Shaq diverted funds to a private investigation firm under one of his shell trusts. He had a team gather every public arrest Riggs had handled over the past 15 years, cross-referencing patterns in racial demographics, suppression of evidence, and failed court cases. Another contact reviewed warehouse seizure logs, linked to Bellamy, flagging inconsistencies in drug evidence transfer points. Data points began to paint the picture of a unit operating above oversight, feeding a network of laundering, ghost seizures, and staged arrests to protect the flow of illegal revenue, all behind the shield of the badge. But Shaq didn't just want the receipts. He wanted the narrative. That's when he called Elias Monroe, a documentary producer who owed him a favor, one who had once filmed a special on inner-city basketball programs and spent 3 months embedded in marginalized communities, without exploiting them for ratings. I need eyes on Savannah, Shaq said. Discreet, quiet, not news, story. Elias didn't hesitate. Meanwhile, Ruth used her influence to petition for an emergency evidence review, citing irregularities in Leona's intake documentation. The petition didn't mention her paternity or Shaq's involvement. It simply pointed to the facts, the procedural flaws, the planted inconsistencies. The legal cracks were beginning to show. Through all of this, Shaq stayed in the shadows. He didn't tell his inner circle, not even his mother. He couldn't, not until he could look Leona in the eyes and say without doubt, I didn't save you because I'm famous. I saved you because I was supposed to protect you from the start. At night, he'd sit on the edge of his bed and replay clips of her public speaking events, small ones, workshops at the Riverlight Center, community panels, a school visit. She had her mother's voice, calm but full. When she spoke, people listened, not because she was loud, but because her silence had shape. Authority without aggression, fire without smoke. He saw himself in her hands, the way they moved when she explained ideas, palms open, fingers curled with intent. He saw Janelle in the way she nodded thoughtfully, before disagreeing. That same quiet defiance. He had missed so much, but he would not miss this. On the third night, Ruth called him again. I filed the petition. The judge is new, but not blind. He's taking it seriously. There'll be a hearing. Could take a week. Shaq's voice was steady. Then I'll wait in the shadows. But if they push this too far, I'll pull them into the light, she finished. The next morning, Leona was moved from general holding into private custody under a temporary review order. She didn't know who had triggered it. Her lawyer said a motion had been granted. No details. Just a legal pause in a system that rarely ever paused. But someone was moving. And though she couldn't name him, she felt the shift, like a wind changing course just before the storm breaks. Far away, in a quiet room filled with old regrets and new resolve, Shaq stared at his reflection. He no longer saw the retired star, the public figure, the smiling face on cereal boxes and TV cameos. He saw a father, and this time, he wasn't going to miss the moment that mattered. The walls of the holding unit didn't echo. That was the first thing Leona noticed. Every sound in that place, footsteps, keys, breath, coughs, got swallowed by the concrete and metal, like the building itself was tired of listening. The lights overhead were always on, flickering slightly at the edges, humming low like they knew too much. There were no clocks, no windows, and no difference between noon and midnight. Leona had stopped counting the hours. Instead, she measured time in ink. A guard had given her a composition notebook 3 days earlier, maybe out of pity or boredom. The pages were thin, the kind that curled when written on too long. But it was enough, she wrote, to keep from unraveling. Not about the arrest, not directly. The facts were too absurd to commit to paper. Instead, she journaled in layers, reflections about childhood, memories from the center, names of people she'd helped, little moments where justice had briefly felt real. Beneath each story, she left blank spaces, not for lack of words, but because the silence spoke louder now. Her handwriting stayed steady, but her thoughts began to stretch wider. She'd replay the arrest over and over in her mind. The officers never asked about her work directly. They didn't mention any gang ties or specific evidence beyond what they supposedly found. It all moved too quickly, like it had been rehearsed. There were no questions, only a verdict masquerading as a process. That's when suspicion took root. It grew slowly, Not like panic, but like frost across a window, spreading cold reason into the parts of her that still wanted to believe in due process. She'd flagged files, yes, but they weren't even high priority. Misfiled memos, irregular timelines, some chain of custody logs that didn't add up. She'd sent a quiet note to her supervisor about it, who brushed it off with a smile too polished to be sincere. Now, here she was, behind steel and glass, and no one from the center had called. No lawyer, no advocate. The silence from the outside was deafening. In the middle of the second night, the dream returned. Same as before. She stood alone in a wide gym. The air smelled like varnish and echoes. There was no crowd, no noise, only the sound of a basketball slowly bouncing. At the far end of the court stood a figure, tall, massive, a silhouette too large to be ordinary. His face was obscured, like he stood behind a fog, but his posture was calm. In his right hand he held a basketball. He extended it to her, not throwing it, not dropping it, just offering it. She never moved to take it. She always woke up before she could. She wrote the dream down again in her journal, this time sketching the outline of the court, beside the entry. Below the drawing she wrote, "Something about him feels familiar, like an echo I've never heard before." Back in her cell, she kept to herself. The other women in the unit barely spoke. Most of them rotated in and out within a day or two. Petty charges, court delays. Leona's case sat in limbo. When she asked the guard why her bail hadn't been set yet, he shrugged like it wasn't his problem. It wasn't. On the morning of the fourth day, her cell door opened without warning. A new officer, one she hadn't seen before, called her name and motioned for her to follow. No explanation, no details, just a silent escort down a quiet hallway into a small observation room. Clean walls, plastic chairs, a metal table. A woman sat waiting. "Your name's Leona Brooks," she said, not as a question but as confirmation. Her hair was salt and silver, braided tightly and pinned low. Her voice had weight, like it had spent years carrying more than it should. "I'm Judge Ruth Delacroix. I'm reviewing your intake." Leona sat across from her cautiously. "This isn't your arraignment," Ruth continued, "but the court flagged inconsistencies in your paperwork. I've been granted temporary review authority." Leona's breath hitched. "Why?" "Because someone filed for it. Someone who's watching." That was all she said on the matter. Ruth didn't offer details. She asked Leona about her job, her record-keeping protocols, how she came across the flagged files. She listened without interruption, took notes slowly. Her questions weren't invasive, just exact. "I didn't do what they're accusing me of," Leona said quietly, when the silence stretched long. "I believe you." That answer came quickly, without doubt. It startled Leona more than she expected. "Then who? Why would anyone do this?" Ruth looked up from her notepad. "Because corruption doesn't need reasons when silence is convenient. But you poked holes in something old. Something too carefully constructed to survive your kind of curiosity." Leona blinked, absorbing the words like static before a storm. "Who's watching me?" she asked. Ruth paused, then smiled, not with her mouth, but with her eyes. "Someone who sees more than you think. For now, stay quiet. Stay still. Your voice matters more when it arrives at the right time." The meeting ended there. No promises, no explanations. But for the first time, Leona felt something shift. Not safety, not yet, but traction, like the gears behind this broken machine were starting to strain against themselves. Back in her cell, she returned to the notebook. She added new questions beside her journal entries, dates, patterns, people. She wasn't writing for therapy anymore. She was building a map. That night, the dream came back again, sharper now. Same gym, same figure. But this time, he took a step closer. Still holding the basketball, he lowered his hand slowly and pointed at the hoop behind her. Leona turned her head. The net swayed gently, as if from wind, though the air was still. When she turned back, the figure was gone. She woke with a jolt, heart pounding. She didn't know what it meant, but it didn't feel like a dream anymore. It felt like a message, and she was starting to believe that someone somewhere was sending it. Days passed with no updates, no court date, no new charges, just waiting. But something about the waiting had changed. The officers seemed more measured now, cautious in their glances. One handed her breakfast without the usual indifference. Another accidentally referred to her as Miss Brooks, instead of inmate. Small things, but they hinted at something unfolding behind the curtain. She stayed ready. When she wasn't writing, she stretched her mind, recited old case studies, built arguments in her head. She ran timelines backward, connecting dots that had seemed harmless at the time. Coworkers who suddenly got quiet, files that vanished from the shared drive, awkward pauses during meetings. None of it made sense before. Now it all did. The frame-up wasn't random. It wasn't personal either. It was strategic, cold, surgical. She had stepped too close to a truth no one wanted unearthed. Her crime wasn't action, it was perception. The ability to notice what others ignored.
That made her dangerous.
And yet, somewhere beyond the bars and shadows, someone had noticed her back. She didn't know it yet, but every word in her notebook was about to matter. Every observation, every unanswered question. Because silence could be weaponized, but it could also be sharpened into signal. And Leona Brooks was far from done speaking. The results came in the form of a plain, unbranded envelope, delivered by hand. No digital trail, no record of transaction. Inside, a single piece of paper with 3 bolded lines: name, sample match, and percentage. Leona Marin Brooks, 99.8% match. Biological daughter of Shaquille R. O'Neal. Shaq read it 3 times before he exhaled. Not with surprise, with confirmation. Somewhere deep down, he had known. The resemblance, the calm in her eyes, the way she carried herself, as if silence was armor and truth was currency. It hadn't been a guess. It had been gravity pulling him toward a truth his past had been trying to bury for 20 years. He sat alone in his living room, lights off, the early morning sun just beginning to creep across the floor. The document in his hands felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just about paternity, it was about legacy. The kind of legacy that had nothing to do with basketball or business, but with broken timelines and second chances that didn't come easy. Leona was his daughter, and she had no idea. He didn't call her, didn't write, didn't rush to declare it to the world. That wasn't what she needed. Not now. She didn't need the chaos of headlines, or the intrusion of celebrity. She needed justice. Clean, clear, and irreversible. She needed the truth to win on its own terms, not because a famous last name stepped into the ring. So Shaq went to work, quietly, methodically, as if preparing for a game where the stakes were too sacred to lose. Ruth Delacroix met him that evening at a safe location, an old historic home turned legal archive on the city's edge. She listened as he handed her the DNA results, his jaw tight, his eyes tired. "She's yours," Ruth said, more to acknowledge the weight than the science. "She was always mine," Shaq replied, voice low. "I just didn't know where to find her." They sat across from one another as the plan unfolded. Ruth had already set the wheels in motion. The judicial review was formally filed under grounds of procedural fraud and systemic bias. But now, with this new information, they had leverage not tied to celebrity, but to institutional liability. The girl they were trying to disappear wasn't just innocent. She was a bridge to an unresolved corruption case from 2 decades ago. And now, unmistakably, she had a father with the means to dismantle everything that protected it. "We don't use your name yet," Ruth warned. "We use the pressure. We let the system know it's being watched. And we find a crack." That crack came in the form of Elias Monroe, the investigative journalist Shaq had reached out to weeks earlier. Monroe wasn't part of mainstream media anymore. He had left cable news, after one too many editorial compromises. These days he ran a lean, independent network of researchers and whistleblowers, publishing raw, unfiltered investigations online. His stories didn't trend, they ignited. Shaq didn't speak to him directly. Instead, Ruth delivered an envelope, unmarked, sealed in black wax. Inside were photocopies. The original fire case from Janelle Carter's death, Leona's sealed birth certificate, donation receipts from the O'Neill Foundation to the Riverlight Center, and 2 flagged arrest reports from Detective Riggs and Officer Bellamy, each connected to suppressed evidence and vanishing witnesses. No context, no request, just facts. Monroe received it on a Tuesday morning. He opened it, expecting fluff. By noon, his entire research team was mobilized. By evening, he'd already connected half a dozen dots the public never even knew existed. There was enough material to break a city-wide scandal, if not more. Still, Shaq kept his distance. It wasn't time for the spotlight. Not yet. His focus stayed on the procedural path. With Ruth's direction, They traced the money trail. Deposits from shell companies into Bellamy's offshore accounts, questionable property transfers under Riggs's wife's name, and a string of falsified overtime slips logged during nights where planted arrests occurred. They weren't just corrupt, they were organized. Ruth leaned into her network of former clerks and sympathetic judges, nudging internal audits and back-channel reviews. Within 5 days, the court had granted a formal review hearing for Leona's case, an action that hadn't occurred in Savannah's jurisdiction in over 8 years. It was a silent earthquake in a place built to resist movement. Meanwhile, inside her cell, Leona remained unaware of the DNA test, the files in Monroe's hands, or the man sitting miles away watching her future unfold with the precision of a surgeon preparing for something sacred. She still held tight to her silence, unaware her voice was about to become a detonator. Shaq spent most nights in his private study, watching old footage of Janelle. He had gathered everything he could find: club recordings, late-night interviews, even a blurry VHS tape of a performance at a lounge in Miami. The year before the fire, her voice filled the room with sorrow and fire, and every note cut a little deeper into the truth he'd neglected for too long. She'd tried to reach him. He knew that now. He remembered the missed calls, the unanswered messages, the silence he had mistaken for closure. He couldn't undo it, but he could honor it. And for Leona, late one night, he penned a letter, not to be sent, not yet, just words on paper, in his own handwriting. Words she might read one day. I didn't leave. I lost you. But I see you now, and I will not look away again. He folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it inside a leather-bound journal. A journal that now held entries about her, pages of notes, clipped articles, sketches of timelines. He was building a map, not just for her defense, but for the truth she would one day walk into. A truth built not on spectacle, but on strategy. A few days later, Monroe's team released the first part of their exposé. Anonymous, explosive, undeniable. It didn't name Leona yet, nor Shaq, but it pulled hard at the threads. Patterns of wrongful arrests in Savannah, falsified police reports, and a decades-old fire case tied to a young woman's disappearance. The article dropped at midnight. By dawn, the city was stirring. And in one corner of that awakening world, a girl still waited behind bars, holding her silence like a blade. And just beyond her reach, her father, no longer lost, no longer distant, stood waiting with a plan that would change everything. It started as a whisper on an independent news blog, a single headline buried beneath celebrity gossip and sports updates. Pattern of corruption in Savannah Police Department. Exposed, a community betrayed. At first few clicked. Those who did found no flashy graphics, no sensationalism, just names, dates and data that bled truth in black and white. But by noon, it wasn't a whisper anymore. Cass Donnelly, a fiercely independent journalist, known for chasing stories no one else dared touch, had picked it up. Monroe's research had landed in her inbox days earlier. She hadn't believed it at first. The story seemed too clean, too devastating, too complete. But after 2 days of phone calls, quietly verified documents, and one former precinct staffer who agreed to speak off record, she knew what she had wasn't just a lead, it was a rupture. The published report hit harder than anyone expected. It named names. Not just Riggs and Bellamy, but a full web of complicity. Clerks, supervisors, even a retired lieutenant whose signature was tied to dozens of tampered evidence logs. It traced decades of misfiled cases, staged drug seizures, and systemic silencing of whistleblowers. It linked the unexplained deaths of multiple community figures to mishandled investigations, including one case that had been closed years ago without follow-up, the apartment fire that killed Janelle Carter. For most of Savannah, the name meant little, but for those watching closely, it cracked something open. Within hours, local civil rights groups demanded a review of every arrest linked to Riggs and Bellamy. By evening, a candlelight vigil stood outside the Riverlight Justice Center, with signs that read, "We want the truth," and "We remember Janelle." And in the precinct, the pressure shifted from background noise to a low, insistent roar. Riggs slammed the report onto his desk, fingers trembling not from fear but rage. The photos printed across the screen, boxes of old case files, blurred witness statements, arrest timelines that no longer aligned. They weren't supposed to exist. Someone had breached the vault. Someone had their hands on the blueprints of everything he had built to remain buried. Bellamy walked in with a copy under his arm, face drawn, voice lower than usual. They're circling. Internal Affairs is opening formal review. Riggs didn't look up. Bellamy continued. You think Monroe leaked it? No, Riggs muttered. This came from someone deeper. Someone who's waited a long time. The silence stretched. Bellamy folded his arms. They're going to burn us. You did what I told you, Riggs said flatly. They won't touch you if you keep quiet. But Bellamy didn't look convinced anymore. He'd read the comments under the article. He'd seen the faces of the people outside the station, people who weren't just angry, but organized. This wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was a reckoning. And for the first time, he wasn't sure Riggs had a way out. Across town, Shaq stood in the back of a quiet press room, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and black jeans. No entourage, no flashing smile. Ruth had arranged the meeting with Cass Donnelly, under strict conditions. No cameras, no audio, no mention of his name, until he allowed it. Cass sat across from him, sharp-eyed and still processing what she had stumbled into. You're confirming, she said softly. The girl, Leona, she's yours. Shaq nodded once. Cass didn't blink. Why now? Because I didn't come to protect her with fame. I came to give her what she never got. Truth. Not in a soundbite, not in a headline, but in every room that failed her. Cass leaned forward. You know this isn't just about her. This blows open the precinct, the courts, maybe the city itself. Shaq's voice was low but steady. Then let it break. Cass hesitated. When do I publish your name? Not yet. Let the story live without me first. If I'm the face, they'll chase a distraction. I want them chasing the truth. She nodded. They will. That evening, Cass updated the story, not with his name, but with a single sentence that would ignite speculation across the country. The father of the falsely accused has come forward, a man with the power to be heard, and the silence to make them listen. Leona hadn't seen the update yet. In her holding cell, she sat at the edge of her cot, notebook open, writing as she had every night. But tonight, something in her felt different. The guards were more measured. The food tray came warmer than usual. One officer, silent all week, whispered as he passed. They're talking about you out there. She didn't ask who or why. She simply closed her notebook, held it close, and waited, because something was coming. And this time, the world was watching. It didn't happen with ceremony. There was no dramatic courtroom outburst, no gavel slam echoing through marble halls. Instead, Leona's release came quietly, almost suspiciously quiet. A late afternoon call to the holding unit. A cold-handed officer unlocking her cell door with barely a glance, and a simple phrase spoken like a memo. You're free to go. No apology, no explanation. She stood still for a second, processing the silence more than the words. Her hands had gone numb. Her body hadn't moved this freely in days. She didn't ask why. She didn't trust the moment enough to question it. Her belongings were returned in a thin brown envelope. Phone, keys, a notebook, slightly crumpled. No one met her at the exit. The sky was gray, the kind of sky that hangs heavy with unshed rain. She walked through the gate alone. A black SUV sat idling by the curb. Tinted windows. No plates. She hesitated. The door opened from the inside before she could ask. Judge Ruth Delacroix sat in the passenger seat, waving her over. Come on. Leona slid in. The door shut behind her with finality. They drove for 10 minutes in silence. Ruth didn't explain where they were going, and Leona didn't ask. She kept her eyes on the road, trying to understand how the world could look the same, while everything inside her had changed. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. But she was wary, suspended in a space between anger and awe. Ruth finally spoke. Your case didn't fall apart by accident. You were being watched. Not by the people who wanted to hurt you, but by someone who refused to look away. Leona turned toward her. Who? Ruth didn't answer. Instead, she nodded toward the window. You'll see. They pulled into a gated property on the edge of the city. It wasn't flashy, just wide and quiet, wrapped in oak trees and calm. The gates closed behind them. A figure stood at the top of the drive, waiting. He was taller than she expected, broader, familiar in a way that struck something deep and unspoken. He didn't move until the car stopped completely. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. Leona got out. The gravel crunched under her shoes. She stared at him. Shaquille O'Neal didn't speak. He didn't offer his hand or lead with a smile. He simply looked at her like a man trying to memorize a face he had searched for too long. Her voice came first. Why am I here? Shaq exhaled. Because you need to know. He gestured for her to follow. Ruth stayed behind, letting the moment belong to them. Inside the house, the air was warm. Framed photos lined the walls, not of fame, but of family. Kids, smiles, handwritten notes beneath some of them. He led her into a study. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal, open to the page she would never forget. A photo, her mother, holding her as a baby, and beneath it, a letter in Shaq's handwriting. She read the first few lines, and her breath caught. She looked up at him. You knew my mother. I loved her, Shaq said, steady and clear. Not long, but real. Leona's jaw tightened. You weren't there. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know she died in that fire. I didn't know you existed until I saw your name on the news. She wanted to scream. She wanted to believe him. She didn't know which impulse to trust. You saved me, she whispered. I should have protected you, he replied. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was sacred, suspended in emotion. Neither one had fully named. Shaq stepped closer and handed her a folder, the same one he'd studied for weeks. Inside were records, DNA confirmation, her birth certificate, the false arrest reports, his personal letters to Ruth and Monroe, copies of every step he took. She sank into a chair, flipping through each page like it might shatter in her hands. You didn't go to the press. I didn't want the world to know before you did. She closed the folder. Her hands trembled, but her voice steadied. So what now? You walk in, make things right, and expect me to just be your daughter. Shaq shook his head gently. No, I expect nothing. But you deserve to know who you are, and who made sure you weren't erased. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she had carried too much for too long without knowing where any of it came from. She stood up.
I don't know what to do with this.
You don't have to decide today. She looked at him, really looked, and in his expression she didn't see fame. She saw grief, and patience, and something else. Hope? Her voice dropped. You really didn't know. No. Then why help me like this? Shaq's voice cracked just slightly. Because I couldn't be the reason you were lost again. She nodded once, then turned toward the door. Her hand paused on the frame. I'm not ready, she said. I'll wait, he replied. She left the room without looking back. Outside, the rain finally came. It fell gently, like something releasing. She stood in the doorway of the house, face turned upward, notebook still clutched in her hand. Her silence wasn't resignation. It was a choice. The truth had been unearthed. The story was rewritten. But redemption, she now understood, was never quiet. It came in waves. And she was just learning how to swim. The press conference was scheduled for noon, but by 10:30 the sidewalk outside the Riverlight Justice Center pulsed with movement. Cameramen adjusted tripods, volunteers passed out flyers, activists stood shoulder to shoulder with clergy and college students, holding signs that bore a name once nearly erased. Leona Brooks. Inside the building, Leona sat alone in a small prep room. The air was still, her palms were warm, not with nerves, but with energy. Not once in the past week had she rehearsed her speech out loud. She had written it, yes, but she hadn't practiced, not because she feared faltering, but because she wanted the words to arrive raw, as lived experience, not performance. Across the room, Ruth Delacroix waited silently, her presence calm and grounding. She gave no notes, no advice. She trusted Leona more than any script. A knock came. A young assistant opened the door and nodded. They're ready for you. Leona rose, smoothed her blazer, and stepped into the hallway. Her steps were steady, her gaze forward. She passed familiar walls, the same ones she'd walked every day for years without knowing they would one day carry her name into history. Outside, as she approached the podium, the crowd fell into a hush that held its own gravity. Photographers lifted their lenses. Reporters leaned in. Behind her, Ruth stood to one side, and beside Ruth, silent and still, stood Shaquille O'Neal. Leona didn't acknowledge him with a glance. Not because she was ignoring him, but because this moment wasn't his to carry. It was hers. She stepped up to the microphone. My name is Leona Marin Brooks, she began. Not inmate 47 2B. Not an anonymous arrest photo. Not a case file built on lies. I'm standing here today not because the system allowed me to, but because I refused to disappear. She let that settle before continuing. I was framed, the same way many others have been, by officers paid to protect, by silence cultivated to protect power. My story is not unique. That's what makes it so important. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked, but no one spoke over her. I learned the truth in fragments. That my mother died in a fire that should have been investigated. That the man who buried her story would one day bury mine. That I have a father whose name carries weight. But it wasn't his fame that freed me. It was the truth. Layered, dangerous, unflinching. Jury. She paused. I didn't come here to celebrate. I came here to build. She turned slightly and motioned to a table beside her, where a banner hung with a new logo. The Janelle Carter Justice Initiative. With the help of Ruth Delacroix and Shaquille O'Neal, we are launching a fund to investigate wrongful arrests, support whistleblowers inside the justice system, and provide legal assistance to the communities most harmed by institutional silence. This isn't a one-time statement, it's a sustained disruption. Applause broke out, some of it slow, rising like a tide that couldn't be stopped. And for those who asked why I didn't take this moment to stand as Shaquille O'Neal's daughter, I say this: I am proud of the blood that runs through me. But I am not stepping forward in his shadow. I am stepping forward in the name of every person who had their truth swallowed by broken systems. Her voice didn't waver. If anything, it grew stronger. This isn't closure, it's ignition. That line hit. The crowd leaned in. Phones rose higher. Because I won't be the last person they try to erase. But I promise I will not be the last one who rises after. When she stepped away from the mic, the applause wasn't frenzied. It was focused. The kind of clapping that felt more like a heartbeat. Ruth stepped forward to meet her with a hand on her shoulder. Shaq stood back, his eyes wet, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. She had spoken for both of them. Later that evening, headlines shifted from speculation to truth. DA announces indictments of Riggs and Bellamy on charges of evidence tampering. Civil rights violations. The old guard cracked under pressure. Bellamy turned first, flipping on Riggs in exchange for a deal. The department began combing through years of closed cases. Community groups mobilized in real time. And through it all, Leona stayed visible. Not as a victim, not as a celebrity's daughter, but as a name reborn into purpose. She and Ruth co-chaired the fund. Shaq funded it without putting his name on the board. This is her story, he'd said. Let her build it. But he remained close, not as an icon, but as a father learning how to show up in the quiet moments. Sometimes he'd sit across from her at strategy meetings, listening. Sometimes he'd call just to ask how she was sleeping. And sometimes when neither had the words, they'd meet in silence and let the presence be enough. The notebook she once wrote in behind glass and steel now sat on her desk, framed in a shadow box. Inside it, one line had been circled again and again. I was never meant to be silent. And as the weeks passed and the story grew beyond her city, beyond her case, beyond the headlines, one truth remained, not etched in court transcripts or press releases, but in the eyes of those who'd heard her speak. She was never just somebody's daughter. She was a story that refused to be erased. If this story lit a fire in you, don't let it fade. Share the silence that fought back. Echo the truth that couldn't be buried. Speak their names, challenge the system, and choose to remember. Because stories like Leona's don't end. They begin movements. And movements only rise when you decide to stand in them.